Hello, Catholic YouTube. Brian with City of the Immaculata back with you. Usually when I have one of these guests come on, it's somebody that I have reached out to, and I'm always, I'm never going to have somebody on that I'm not like excited to have on, but I'm particularly excited to have on today's guest. Uh, Full disclosure, I uh, know Andy personally. Andy is the youngest sibling of my wife. So I would say for a better part of a decade now, I have considered Andy my own brother. And what I would usually do is begin with an introduction, but I think we're going to sort of forego the formal introduction today to give Andy the chance to tell what I think is going to be a really like interesting story for you guys. Well, first off, Andy, hello. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Yeah, thanks for having me on your show. And those are really striking pictures in the intro. That especially that one of the confession. That's very beautiful.
Yeah, and you just jogged my memory on that. I had a question come in the other day in one of the comments, and I forgot. Actually, I haven't replied to, so sorry to the person that asked it. But the intro song, it's my own playing, and it is a variation of an old spiritual called "Jesus is a Mighty Good Leader." So, the
Mm,
person that wanted to know what that song was, that's what that was. Um,
mm,
so yeah, Andy, before I guess we dive too deep into the parts and the whole of the parts of your spiral, can you kind of lay out maybe first what some of your story is, your background, and how it sort of led you up to the doorstep of the heal project that
mhm,
you've engaged in, as well as the spiral that we'll be discussing today?
mhm. Yeah, so the story gets contextualized, or like what I share about my story, contextualized about like what I'm doing now. So a little bit about what I do now, and then like, yeah, how did I get there? So yeah, I'm the founder of Heal. Heal is a personal development coaching practice. And our whole shtick is that we help people be God by being themselves through the art of organization. Um, so how I got into that is first for about 2 years I was doing organizational coaching, and I thought I thought that's quote unquote all I was doing. So I would help people in an individual basis organize their life. And I would get into these one-to-one sessions, and sometimes it would just flow exactly kind of how you think it would flow. You figure out what's kind of a blockage, and then how do you frame that in terms of action, and then okay, they're off and running. Then other times the session would go in a different direction, and it would end, and the client would kind of chuckle with a little bit of embarrassment, be like, haha, like, thanks for helping me. That was really helpful. Sorry, you probably didn't expect, to be running a therapy session. And that happened too many times for me to ignore. To me, it didn't seem unusual. It seemed very normal. And I would tell the person, like, hey, like, we're here to make sense of whatever is creating dissonance or where you feel dissonance in your life. So it's all part of the thing. But there was something about um, other people putting into words that they thought that was outside of the scope of what we were doing that helped me see what I knew the scope to be, but like maybe was obvious to me and not obvious to other people. So it's starting to put into words what that was. Um, and then it became this thing of like, okay, when we started teaching this method for organizing one's life, we had built it off of Catholic anthropology. So I had gone back down into Aquinas, and then through Aquinas down into Aristotle, and we had built a behavioral model off of their model of the mind, essentially. And what started to present itself as like, okay, there, if we did that well, then what we were doing for one area in a person's life should be applicable to multiple areas in a person's life, because we were working from the sort of like first principles of human nature rather than particularities of a specific field. So it started to flower out into, okay, how about we're not just helping people organize their time and to-dos, but we're also helping them organize their knowledge. And then that eventually flowered out into emotions. And then it all kind of clicked into places like, okay, you kind of look at one of the models of the three powers of the soul being the intellect, the will, and the affections. This was matching that threefold, I don't know, we call them areas now. And it started to lead to bigger questions of like, okay, what I would see, we could now see, okay, this is something that naturally goes into those three areas of a person's life, which we call their hands, their head, and their heart. It matches onto the intellect, the will, and the affections. But what I would see then is someone would come in and they were feeling disorganized. And in one sense, one part of them could see, hey, this is the thing that I want to change. But they would come, there'd be a couple sessions in a row where they actually hadn't made progress on that thing. And it wasn't because they didn't know about it. Like intellectually, it was all very clear, right? But it was layers below that. And the more I interacted in those dynamics, the more I would see what was really driving or clogging up the flourishment in that person was how they were conceiving of themselves, their self-conception. So what did they, and ultimately the biggest kicker there was when someone conceived of themselves as fundamentally bad rather than fundamentally good. The problem was with Christian clients, sometimes that self-conception was tied into theological views, or like there's some inertia or a set of patterns in terms of how they lived their faith or conceived of their faith that was between them and that proper conception of self. So it quickly turned into this thing of like, well, wait, actually, what are we doing here? And how do I tie this into where I came from? Well, basically, as that developed, I realized like the things that I thought I was only doing this because I was skilled at teaching someone and I enjoyed going deep one-to-one with the person. What the Lord shown me is like there's many other things that happen in my life that set up the stage for this kind of work. So when someone asks me like, how do I get into this? What I really go back to is what for me feels like the seed of all of this, which was when I was 17. It started a lot earlier than when I was 17, but when I was 17, I had this very, at the time, bizarre experience where I was dating someone at the time, and we were hanging out in my front yard, and we had just gotten back from Stations of the Cross, and for whatever reason, after Stations there was benediction, and then we came back, and my girlfriend at the time said, "Hey, Andy, like when the priest was putting our Lord back into the tabernacle, I thought of you, like I imagined you being a priest and kind of carrying our Lord back into the tabernacle, and it just kind of like made sense or something." And so then she asked me, "Have you ever thought about being a priest?" So at that moment, when she asked me those words, I didn't have the words for it at the time, but what the experience was like is that um I felt that like a destiny was like put onto me. Like I had just gotten the sentence of my life. Um and at the very moment realized that I didn't want it. But like I couldn't have known that until it was put in front of me. So it's like I was I felt um called into that life, and at the same time it felt like a death sentence, or it felt like um something very dark and heavy about it. But I didn't know what to do with that at the time, because I was very clear that I wanted to I've always wanted to give my life to God, um full throttle. But so what does that mean if giving your life to God is basically self-destruction? So I didn't know what that meant. Um, and basically I followed this kind of gut dark instinct. And what was being colored was that this whole experience was surfacing this patterns of beliefs in me that had their own history, but that essentially would be boiled down to this: that to grow close to God is to distance oneself from self. Like holiness looks like the melting away of self, or the a sort of violent sacrifice of self, in order to then be able to be enter into union with God. There wasn't any nuance in my understanding at that time. It was a misunderstanding of Galatians 2:20, right? So it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. I took that very literally, and I looked around in my life at anything that I desired, and I tied a tourniquet between me and that thing. And so that was not a sustainable way of living. I plummeted into a very deep state of depression. For me, yeah, I still remember one of these Thanksgivings. Like, I love Thanksgiving. It's an amazing time, and you're with your family, and it's the best food and all that. But I remember this one Thanksgiving, kind of like being in it, and then feeling feeling happy about these things, but then another part of my mind coming in being like, oh, that means like the fact that you're happy about this thing means that this is what God wants you to give up. Like, this is a thing to sacrifice and give away. So I operated in that manner for about 2 or 3 years. A pivotal thing for me, though I didn't know what it meant, was at a certain point my body broke out into hives, head to toes. And for me, this was like it's like, well, I didn't choose that. So what the heck does that mean? And I didn't fully have the words to process it, but it was something along the lines of like, hey, there's multiple ways of knowing things. Like, the way that knowledge works, it's not just a mental activity. It's not just the conscious thoughts that I have in my head is a summation of what it means to know. Um, there is some manifestation of my body knowing something, knowing that what I was pursuing was not actually a good or healthy thing, and it's sending up some kind of like flare, right? Um, to catch my attention. And that shook me. And started. It gave a little bit of a pattern interruption and a break for me to reconsider, like, what exactly is going on here. So ever since that moment, ever since that experience of like um, that sort of like, I don't know, death sentence experience, I've been a student of the interior. Like, I love learning more and more about what exactly is goes on inside a person, um, and what are proper and improper ways of conceiving self, and how does that spill out and have a ripple effect in terms of how a Christian lives his life, and then consequently how the church either grows or doesn't grow. And there's been a ton of lessons along the way. But that's when I think about like, why do I do what I do now? It's like I've started caring about this stuff since that moment. And then I've followed that wherever it's gone. And so now it happens to be leading in this direction with coaching people.
Yeah, it's super fascinating. I have my own project that I've been working on for a couple of years now. And it's funny, a lot of these things for many of us are born out of these sort of like existential situations that happen in our lives that make us kind of confront certain realities that we hadn't, maybe we can blame it on youthful naivety or whatever it is we hadn't considered up to that point. And I have teased my own project on this channel a little bit, but I'm not going to go too deeply into it. But I've noticed a similar thing that I think that you have noticed is as you're like diving into these, be it metaphysical or not, a corollary between certain triads that you find in the way that we work around um, the way that we work through certain processes. And we're not the only ones, Andy, to have pointed this out. I think you would probably be not surprised to find that it actually has kind of a ancient tradition to it, and I recently have put together a work on enculturation, and one of the things that I did was I went back into certain pagan pre-Christian customs, and I interestingly found that there was a love of triads within Celtic, pagan, Irish culture that pre-existed actually St. Patrick's missionizing to the Irish. And so when Patrick came to the island, he found a people already looking out at
Primed.
the
Yep.
primed for it, right? Looking out at the spiritual world, finding these trifectas everywhere. And he took the invisible and made it visible for them, as a way of evangelizing. But also you find it I'm not as well versed in Thomas as I would like to be on these things, but I know you find it in Bonaventure a lot. Bonaventure like
That makes sense.
absolutely loves his triads. Like if you read his works, it's like everywhere. I mean, he's even got like his famous one of his mystical writings is called the Triple Way. And then you will find it in his obviously he discusses the powers of intellect, will, and memory.
Yep.
And I think there is something, and it's part of the, of course, the Trinitarian aspect of the faith tradition that we are coming from. But I absolutely love that through your own, because it sounds like it was kind of a maybe a natural progression for you to come to this sort of
It's very ground up.
realization,
Yeah.
of the sort of triadic structure of the HEAL program. And these, like I said, these corollaries to other things that are out there that could sort of map onto it. I don't know if I'm being too esoteric here in my response to what you were saying, but that was just something that stood out to me in what you were saying there.
Yeah. Well, so you bringing that helps me feel a bit of a gap in the sense of like, oh, okay. Like I'm thinking about this stuff 24/7, but to bring the listener in a bit, am I able to share my screen? And here, I don't know if that's possible. It's okay if it's not, but if I would put the visual up of the B spiral. Your screen. It seems like I can, so I'm going to do it. Is that okay, Brian? Cool. Like if I do this, yeah, you're seeing this thing. Your mic is muted.
You should be able to add it to the stage.
Okay, so right now it's not sharing. It says,
Here, let me add it for you.
Okay, cool. Oh,
There we
what?
go.
Look at that. How'd you get that? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay. This is like fancy. This is fancier than it was. Okay. So what Brian is referring to is, what this has all boiled down to in my life is, this visual right here. And the visual is communicating something which is there's things that people pursue, and unless they are understood to be the same thing, or at least interconnected, one can't pursue fully the thing that they're looking for. So, for example, a lot of people come to me and they want to be organized, right? The problem is they view um, being themselves or divinization, being God, as something disassociated with this pursuit of being organized. Or sometimes you might have someone and they are very, like, let's say, pious. I'm not saying the genuine form of piety, but there's like an intensity about their spirituality. They definitely want to be holy. They might not even be comfortable saying this of being God or becoming God. But let's say that they are. They certainly don't view it as this. They would say being God, the more they move towards that, the more they're moving away from being oneself. But the whole argument here is this is a three-directional interconnection. So if someone wants to be organized, they're not really going to be organized unless they have a deep sense of self-knowledge that they're living in alignment with the core, deepest desires that they have, and also that they're developing spiritually and are growing in communion with God. If those two things are absent, they might think that they're organized, but what's really happening is they're um, they're being very productive, or they're being very um, efficient in controlling aspects of their life, but they're not being fruitful in the ultimate sense. So yeah, you can take this in any direction. You can explore, like, well, what do we actually mean by being God? How does being yourself relate to being God? And there's different angles that different people find interesting, but this is what Brian's referring to. And I'll toss one consideration out here in terms of how we can apply the B spiral to this conversation, which is, you mentioned St. Bonaventure. So St. Bonaventure talks about Christ being our metaphysics. Like, he is our metaphysics. And also you mentioned the Trinity being embedded throughout reality, which would make sense, right? So one consideration is, when we're used to saying, I'm going to stop my screen share now. We're used to saying, okay, we're made in God's image. And we hear that a lot and we say that a lot. What's often, there's a lot of fruit still available there from a stance of contemplation, in the sense of, okay, we're made in God's image, but what does the image of God actually look like? Well, one of the things that it looks like is somehow we have distinction and union being inseparable. So Jesus Christ, being Jesus Christ, doesn't attract or detract from the glory of God the Father or God the Holy Spirit. It only enhances it. I'm speaking in a human term here. So let's just take that one point as an example. Like, we have God and he is one, and at the same time he's three, and his oneness is there's not a tension or a competition between his oneness and his threeness. they they they're the same thing. They support each other, they reinforce each other, whatever. But then when we look at our quote unquote spiritual life, a common way to approach it is to view our distinction, or you could say self, as something that is in competition or goes against the grain of the glory of God. So, and we tend to do this because we look out at the secular world and we see them sort of trying to raise up self without any other kind of support or foundation. And we would say, you know, people, the kind of atmosphere in secular, we could just say American culture, is this kind of narcissistic, self-obsessed sort of thing. And so we're on the outside, we see that, and then we go, okay, well then self is like this bottomless vacuum pit that's going to bring us away from God if we're not too careful. And so we throw the whole thing out. We throw the baby out with bathwater. But the consideration is, wait a second. Every person, every self is a manifestation of God. It is an image of God. So when you look at God, that doesn't cause you to forget about God. That causes you to grow closer to him. So if we're talking about the self, any kind of conception in which there's a danger of falling away from God because we're growing too close to self, we're being too focused on oneself, or like there's an unholy version of self-love or something like this. If that's possible, then there needs to be this question of why is that not also possible when we look within the Trinity? If I am growing close to the Son, that does not mean that I grow far away from the Father. That means I grow closer to the Father. So the same thing should be applying within on the human dimension as well. If we are made in his image, then it should also follow that self is not sort of this enemy of holiness. Like it is one of the paths to it. It's like the path that God gave us. It's the whole medium in which we can live is through and in self. And yet there's a lot of language around self that gets complicated and jumbled up in whatever you could say well-intentioned spiritual writing. But that's enough to either get me in trouble or start a thread in conversation. So yeah.
Well, I've actually covered that. It was maybe a couple months ago at this point. I talked about I think I don't really want to get too deep into a discussion of like the Latin Church, qua the Latin Church. But I recently did one on the question of whether or not like the approach to suffering in the Western context is unhealthy. And I think the word that I used there is whether or not it was sadistic or not, right? I mean, you have a history in the church of the flagellants, right, who took cords to their back in means to mortify the flesh, to reject self. Granted, the flagellants were condemned by the church; they were never like a recognized body of people. But we do have a longstanding tradition of self mortification. But I agree with you that I think that there is at times a misinterpretation and a misapplication of what that is and actually who that's for. Because if you read what I think is one of the great primers of at least for the Western tradition, the spiritual life is Scopoli's The Spiritual Combat. And I think he kind of dives a little bit closer to what you're saying, at least explicitly. I think he gets at it that like a type of like self mortification that you think is earning you like points on the point chart of,
Mhm.
holiness is not necessarily like one type of deprivation done properly is in like, on like tiers levels different, and more efficacious than, just trying to like, self mortify just for the sake of it. So that was, something that's kind of like standing out to me on what you're saying there as well. Um, the idea, and you sometimes, Andy, it's like you border dangerously close to the Franciscan traditions, and I don't know if that's because of your readings or if that's just like a fortuitous thing that's happened. Have you and I ever discussed Scotus's formal distinction before, about how he like makes certain distinctions?
So I'll say two things, and you tell me if that's what you're referring to. Like you've gotten me onto Absolute Primacy of Christ,
Mm-hmm.
that book, and then I remember you saying something along the lines of, I think it was SCOTUS, um, positing that like self is
Mm.
everyone actually is partaking of like a unique essence in self. It's not just like we all share the generic essence of human, but there's like Brian and then there's Andy, and these are like different essences.
Exactly, and that's actually very pertinent. That wasn't what I was thinking of, but that's another like pertinent thing I think that relates to what you're talking about. That would be Scotus's, theory of hoxeity, and I guess it would probably be even more pertinent to go in the direction of that, because with Aquinas, he says that the principle of like what individuates things is the matter. The form
Yeah,
gives it its nature. Matter is what, like, my matter is what individuates me from you, right?
right,
And
right.
then I was thinking about this earlier today, Andy, as like we were kind of anticipating, as I was anticipating talking to you.
Yeah,
The old paradox of, oh, what is it? The Theseus, his ship. Is that how you say his name? Have you heard of that paradox before? Like, if you take a
describe
ship,
it a little bit more. Oh, is it still the same ship?
is it still the same ship after all of
Right.
the parts have been replaced, right? And there's a little bit
Okay.
of that. So, like with Aquinas, he would say, um, I mean, probably he never exactly answered this particular paradox, but it
Sure.
seems like what Aquinas would say is that eventually, at
Mm.
a certain point, there's not
Yeah.
enough matter left for it to be the thing that was originally, Theus's ship.
Yep.
Whereas Scotus would say, I think, if he were to answer this with his Hasaidi, that there is something, it's mysterious, and I think it's okay to have some mystery in
Yeah.
metaphysics. I don't think
Exactly.
we
Yeah.
need to answer
Exactly.
everything, but Scotus says there's a continuing principle of individuation that would actually make the ship the same ship, even after all the, so
Yeah.
long as there
Yeah.
wasn't like a break, right? Like there
Hmm.
wasn't like a clear break where now all the parts are, I don't know exactly how we would work it out, but so long as
Yeah.
there's like a continual process that we can track, Scotus would say that so, and I think that actually gets to, an
Hmm.
important point of self, which is that there is, I think, something, and this kind of comports with maybe where we're at. I can't tell you all the things that we know about physics today, of course, but,
Hmm.
I don't think that matter as such is the thing that could make Andy Andy or Brian Brian. I think there's got to be something else, even if we won't know it on this side of the eschaton.
Hmm.
I feel like you're tapping into it here, because there's something beyond just the matter that we see, these things that make up the self that I am. And you're like, so what you're saying is that it sort of penetrates into this other aspect that you maybe the people aren't considering, right? The aspect, or would you call it the area of the other side of that spiral of like being more God, right, than you are, less.
Yeah. There's so this is really great. There's like, 10 spokes have grown out of what you said there. So one is like an affirmation, like you were saying, of like the mystery of this. So like I'm about to say a bunch of things, and they're all also being said from the standpoint of um, the inability to articulate something is not evidence that it's not real. it can be evidence that it's extremely real and it's larger than the ability to articulate. So like, who was it? It was this Gregory of Saint Gregory of Nyssa talking about the Trinity, and it says his divinity is completely unfathomable, and his essence, which is above all, is not what the mind conceives it to be. So now here we have an interesting application. It's like, okay, so that's true about God, but then sometimes we can forget that like we are made in God's image. So that's also very much true about ourselves. Like we someone waking up one day and being like, I don't know who I am, to the secular modern American, that's a sign of danger or bad or something. But that can also very much be a sign of starting to recognize the mystery of self. And I don't know if I think it's Chesterton. Mystery is evidence of meaning, not evidence of lack of meaning, right? So we should, in one sense, be a mystery. Like we should find ourselves mysterious. If we are made in God's image and God is mysterious, that's fitting. But then there's other things in here too of like, Aquinas is something that's almost on the other side of that um, thing. Maybe it's the same thing, but it's like he doesn't have an answer for what the heck are we in between our death and the resurrection of our body, or the restoration of our body, because we're not, paragraph 365 in the Catechism, spirit and matter in man are not two natures united, but represent a single nature, a distinct and single nature. So often we can be in this thing where it's like, okay, they're the materialists over there, and we know we're not them. And there are the Gnostics over there, and we know we're not them. So we're in the middle, we're in this virtuous mean, and that virtuous mean is both of these things combined. And so the person is matter and spirit combined. But that's precisely what paragraph 365 is saying is not the case, is that we're not two natures united. Doesn't even matter if you can like pump a lot of air into that word united, it's still wrong. It's still off. There's something mysterious about these two things such that they cease being two things within the person. They're one thing. So, yeah, it's like then it brings all these other questions up, like with the ship thing. But Aquinas really has no answer. He just sits there. He's like, I mean, I don't know. What are we? What are we when we have not yet received our glorified and restored body, and we've passed out of this life? In one sense, it seems incomplete or inaccurate to say that we are human. But then it brings up all these other questions of like the interrelation of matter and spirit and stuff. But I'm off into space a little bit. Bring me back if you've got a thought or a follow up.
I do, because I was thinking again about one of the ways I think that this could actually maybe touch back even towards the idea of organization and how that plays into this is that
Cool. Yes.
with Bonaventure, and again I kind of lean into the Franciscan stuff, so you have to bear with me with some of that. With Bonaventure, his position on God is he borrows from Anselm's, the Anselmian tradition of, Anselm says God is that which nothing greater can be thought, which is a much maligned and misunderstood aspect of Anselmian teaching. But Bonaventure takes it to another. He was, you have to sort of understand what they mean by being there. Bonaventure says that God is that which is in full flight from non-being. Okay. And he said that, like, actually, we sort of arise out of this sort of primeval like nothingness, right? Like there was a time when there was no Brian, there was a time when there was no Andy, except
Mm-hmm.
for within the divine ideas, right, which would be its own thing. But
Mm-hmm.
anyways, that nothingness that we arise out of,
Mm-hmm.
as we come into a state of being, we are ever
Oh, got
more
it.
elevated towards that which is in full flight from non-being. We will never be that which is in full flight from non-being, because there's what Bonaventure would call a
Good.
transcendental disjunct
Yep.
between a finite and an infinite thing.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
all the more, and he even says, like, it's in his the mind's journey to God. He talks about how a man in sin is a man that's like bent over himself, and the visual there, if you could like picture it, is like a man bent over himself is sort of staring down into that abyss of nothingness. Whereas the like order that Bonaventure takes things is that first a man would go inward to question the things of what's inside of himself,
Mm-hmm.
and with the mind's journey of God, eventually this would lead man to things that are upward, right, towards God.
Right.
And this
Yes.
is the ordering, if you will, within Bonaventure's what he would call the mystical journey of the mind, actually, to God, which I thought is an interesting thing.
Hmm.
So I'm sort of pulling here together some of the threads. We're kind of got like threads in several different places here, but I think with
Yeah.
the Franciscans have a long tradition of seeing order and hierarchy in the process of creation, and there is no even you brought it up with the absolute
Yeah.
primacy of Christ. When you get to like the theological implications of a ordered universe and an ordered God, then like the absolute primacy of Christ would fall right into that, um, almost like biological deduction of things. But
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we're stored. We're still, I think, speaking more on like an anthropological level. I think it applies there too, right? Because we're coming out of this nothingness. We're coming into being. And the ideal, and this is another part of the like triads of Bonaventure, and cut me off at any point, but the another part of the
Mm-hmm.
triads of Bonaventure is he talks about the uh, vestige, image, and similitude. And he would say that the God's creation is full of vestiges; they're everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next order up from that is a image of God, which would be man, right? We're made in the image of God. You know, there's a trifecta there for Bonaventure
Yeah.
as well. And
Okay.
then by the order of grace, we are elevated to being a similitude, the likeness of God. Sin
Likeness. Yep.
mars that, right? And we sort of suppress that likeness or that similitude, yeah, that likeness that we would have, and we come back closer to the dark abyss of nothingness through sin,
Mm-hmm.
whereas through the order of grace. So, anyways, I'm just trying to say that
Mm-hmm.
there's precedence in the idea of organization as well, in terms of this hierarchy towards um, man, and then from man to God, and how that those things interlink with one another.
Yeah. So like one thing, so there's a couple things that I'm hearing in that. One is um or that's embedded in that. And one is um I've been playing around with this like game, and the game is okay, everybody, and listener, do this as well. um Close your eyes, and then imagine in your mind divine revelation. So your eyes are closed and you're painting a picture in your mind of divine revelation. Okay. And just for fun, Brian, like, what's your picture?
The first thing I see is Christ incarnate. That would be the first image in my mind. I don't know if that's
Right.
cheating or not, but that would be the
No,
first.
that's not cheating. No,
Okay.
that's not cheating. It is a Brian answer, and it's and it's not cheating. Um, what what is around typical responses is like something like scripture. So like you might see the Bible, um, or that's usually the most typical thing, something around the Bible or scripture. Okay. So, but the game is, okay, you've got that image in your mind. Okay, great. Now open your eyes, and you're opening your eyes, and what you are seeing right now is divine revelation. And the whole point of this exercise is to bring, there's different forms of divine revelation, right? Anything that exists by definition is a revelation of the divine. And that model that you just gave of St. Bonaventure, it only makes sense if there's if reality is not this like separate thing from God, but it's like God is the foundation of that stuff, right? And so that then the same thing applies to self. It's like self isn't like this random obstacle. It's something that he created for us to partake in. And what I found is that this becomes a little bit clearer when you look at, like, when you bring in contrast, right? So there's a couple lines that, when I read them, they sound kind of nice. Like, so I'll give a couple. After our free will has been resigned to God, we should abandon every thought and care about all that is ours to the same God and allow him to accomplish his divine will in us without us. Or in those men who do not seek after wealth or honors or utility or interior devotion or sanctity or reward or the kingdom of heaven, but renounce all these things, even that which is theirs, God is honored. But the thing is, like, what I'm reading are condemned propositions. Either they're Jansenistic or they're forms of quietism.
Mm-hmm.
And it's something like, when we see that contrast, okay, fine. But it's like, maybe that sounds a little bit too much of a setup, but like, I wrote this down. This was an exchange between two friends. And one friend had just shared through like a piece of writing, a couple things about herself, and another friend was engaging on this thing, and they were having a conversation. In the conversation, the woman shared, I'm really glad that I've come to this place, because before I was dealing with crippling anxiety. And so then the man responds, and I'm changing the names up here, but the man says, Sarah, been in 2 years of crippling anxiety. That's exactly what I was in, when I started my business 10 years ago. I think our culture normalizes a myth of control and self-improvement, as well as dulls us with entertainment. I suspect crippling anxiety is often what it takes to enter into a much deeper reality. He is in control. He improves us if we let him. And it's not suffering that we should fear, but failing to enter the adventure of love, of the love affair, which is the only real thing about life. And then the friend responds, I couldn't agree more about crippling anxiety. I'm grateful for the times of desolation. They remind me to surrender fully to Jesus and allow him to take care of everything. Getting out of the self is what I focus my efforts on now daily. There's solidarity in knowing other people have been where I've been. Thanks for sharing. So I use that because that's like a very realistic example, like kinds of things that you would typically hear, right? The point that I'm making is, in that exchange is both a mixture of true things and not true things. Like God does change us, but it's not his desire to change us without us. And when we are growing closer to him, it's not us getting out of the self, it's us getting into the self. But there's associations that have a lot of crust around them um, that need to be shaken off or restored in order for that to be understood.
Yeah, I have to say, we moved to a new. I mean, as you're well aware, but for listeners that may not be well aware, my wife and I moved to a new state, and one of the things that we have within the diocese that we moved to is they are doing the restored order for the sacraments, which I am actually particularly happy to find because
Mm-hmm.
it means that my son is going to be getting confirmed, and I do think that there are certain developments that take place which I think are fine, and as long as you have like a proper understanding of like why the development takes place and what
Mm-hmm.
it's the context of it, like I know certain people are not very happy that we withhold the chalice, for example, but there's certain like theological justifications. But while I wouldn't condemn the change in the practice, um, I get the sense at times that there is this. Speaking of like disorganization and
Yeah.
like not organizing things correctly, it seems like something like confirmation or chrismation, however you want to call it, that particular sacrament. Just for example, it becomes this thing where one, it's either a rite of passage for a teen into adulthood, which is never really intended to be that, or
Right.
it becomes this thing where it's like, okay, I have to like once again sit down in a classroom and sort of fill my mind with like the academic side of what the faith is in order to be worthy to receive this sacrament, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to the correct order, which is that seek ye first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the graces that flow
Mm-hmm.
forth from the reception of having your children chrismated with their with the proper order of things. So I was gonna say from that, what you were talking about there, Andy. One of the things it made me think about um, is Saint Maximus's idea of the logi and the how that relates to the logos, right? With the logos
Mm-hmm.
being obviously the uppercase L logos, so the word, which in turn becomes incarnate. But Saint Maximus has this idea that the creation is full of these things that he calls the logi, which is like lowercase l, and it's these
Mm-hmm.
very similar to Bonaventure's like vestiges,
Mm-hmm.
which means that like all of the substrata of creation was pretty much from the beginning designed in such a way to be this relational thing. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously, we know from our own Trinitarian faith that that's really just a manifestation in the created order, a manifestation of what is already pre-existent eternally within the divine Godhead, right? Of this
Mm-hmm.
this triune relationship of persons. But I was wondering because we've kind of um, I feel like we've kind of hovered over self. I think we've kind of maybe ventured. There's a lot more that we could say about the be God aspect. And then with the
Okay.
organization, have we touched enough upon that, or is there more that you would like to say about as far as organization goes? Because I'd like to also, um, while we're picking apart them kind of individually, before we
Yeah.
like finish up for the day, step back from it all and kind of look at the holistic picture again as well. But I want to make sure we cover all of our bases.
Yep. Yeah. So organization. Well, so part of this is connected to um, often there is a false dichotomy between um, doing and being, or contemplation and activity. So there's this element of organization is the same thing. Okay, so first of all, what is organization? Organization, often when people think of things being organized, they think of them as being tidy and typically in their place and still. The thing is, like, the Greek word, the whole foundation for organize or organization is the Greek organon, which is tool for making or doing. It's the same kind of thing, when you talk about the organs inside a body, inside a human body. So there's in organization should carry associations of movement. It should carry associations of a little bit of messiness, like functional messiness. But also you carry into it the sense of organization is tied to essence. So, like, I was talking with Kyle and Sarah Wester, who are parent coaches. And we were talking about organization. And then Sarah made this comment of like, ooh, I guess like my bookshelf is really disorganized because it looked, all the books were in its place and they were still and but it brought up to this point of like organization looks different for the organism. Like each organism has a different manifestation of organization. So for a bookshelf to be organized is going to look very different than Brian to be organized or Katie to be organized. So it then comes back to this whole concept of like to be organized is to be living out in accordance with your essence, which then brings us back to like what exactly is self and what exactly is the destiny of self, or like the direction, the divine intention for self. And you well, so how can we summarize that? So creation, action or movement is not opposed to essence. It can be the manifesting of it, right? So we then have this thing of like, okay, I'll tie it back to two things. One is, look, on the ground, quote unquote, ground level, from a tooly standpoint, there's ultimately 4 behaviors that result in something being organized. And if you want to like drill into that, like, we do have resources for that. If you go to our website, which is heal.co, that is HEL.co, you'll see a purple button. And if you follow that, we have, I've written a series of letters that goes into what exactly are these behaviors and how do they work and all that kind of stuff. Another angle of this, though, is when people think about organizations or think of like a business being organized or a company being organized, something that's tossed around a lot in those conversations is something called core values. And if you're like 99.999% of people, you hear core values and just like, ugh, like this glaze goes over your eyes and you're like, okay, now I'm in like a corporate office and we're creating some weird pyramid graphic that looks ugly and it'll be like laminated and put in the coffee room and no one will ever really do anything about it. But the whole point here is that like core, like that's actually coming linguistically from heart. Like think of courage, the core of a person. And it brings up this whole thing, like you said, with confirmation prep. It's like, okay, let's fill our mind with a bunch of stuff. And if our mind's, ascended to a certain rank, then it can receive something. This is a bigger conversation for another day. I think it comes out of a misunderstanding that's in the Nicomachean ethics, but the equating of the person with the mind is a huge mistake. The mind is not the self. We know this because we can change our mind, but if we're not careful, we can over intellectualize things and we can get lost in our mind. The heart, from a scriptural standpoint, it's much more accurate if we're going to give an image for self, that image is the heart, not the mind. So just one quick reference in the Catechism of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, Christ Our Pascha, it says the heart is the seat not only of feelings, but also of cognition, self-awareness, and consciousness, as well as a human being's other spiritual powers. And so there's this whole tradition of cultivating the heart, because that's the seat of the person. But so how this ties into core values is there are, if we take core out and we put in heart, for example, what are the things that you in the depths of your heart value disproportionately? And it's going to be different for different people. That's a much more accurate picture of core values. And if you put that into writing, if you really sit down and explore that, like, hey, what are like the core handful of questions that I always ruminate? Or what are the kinds of things that when I do them, I feel more alive? A takeaway from this conversation is a consideration that your growth in holiness, growth in divinization includes, necessarily includes you pursuing those things, growing an understanding of what those are, and arranging your life so that you are in touch with them more often, or you are living out of them more often. Because that's not just an arbitrary thing. The core elements of your heart, or the attractions of your heart, the heart is the dwelling place of God. So those are godly movements. So long as we properly understand self as image of God, and we also properly understand reality of like the divine things are manifested in the natural things. Like there's also supernatural things, of course, but the natural world is also participating in divine revelation. So then that directs the whole conversation of like, well, why do I want to be organized in the first place? So I'll say that there's more layers there. Who is it? Saint Macarius the Great. He talks about, look, it's not that simple to grow, to cultivate the heart, because the heart is bombarded. I mean, Satan's number one objective is to instill in the person a hatred of their heart, or a suspicion of their own heart, because this is like the command center. It's like the nuclear factory, for example, or kind of a weird, dumb, crude analogy, but that's the command center of the person. So we should not be surprised if there's barriers between us and our own heart. As Saint Macarius talks about, within the heart is everything. It's there's dragons, lions, poisonous beasts, treasures of evil, uneven roads, but there's also God and the angels and life and the kingdom and all of these things. But it's the Christian duty to cultivate the field of his or her heart, because it's in there that the seed of the enemy is planted. It's not, elsewhere. So I would say the last comment on organization is, remember that it's connected to those other two B's. And if it feels disconnected, there's something off in the conception of those B's, whether it's being God, or being oneself, or being organized. And if you can bring them into alignment, then you're onto something.
The wider picture of all of this would make me want to approach it from the in the Eastern tradition, the relation or the activity is called perichoresis. In the Western tradition, it's called circumcision. And it's the idea of what the relation between the persons in the Trinity is like. And, I
Hmm.
think of it, there's this relation of persons, and then there's this, if we think of God as, in an Aristotelian terms, pure act, right? There's always going to be movement. It's never, it's never like in a state of potential, and it's always between persons. But there's also that unitive aspect of it as well too. And many of the great spiritual masters talk about how the rise up through the spiritual life all the way up to the unitive is a matter of a to use scriptural language, a partaking in the
Yeah.
circumcisionary life of the Trinity, right? So you partake of those relations that is eternally partaking of within the Trinity itself. That was where my mind would want to go, but I think you actually do something that's better in your essay, and I will include in the description of this Andy's website as well as a link to the specific essay, which I think kind of summarizes. Andy and I have been riffing a lot here in this conversation, but he has a very nice summary of this within his essays. And at the end, Andy, you talk about sales, and I thought that was an interesting way to
Yeah.
look at this. So maybe just as far as the wider picture of all of this goes, what was that analogy that you made of the sales there?
Well, so it's the coming full circle to the beginning of that essay. And the beginning of that essay is, look, people are feeling disconnected, and the whole thesis of that essay is they're feeling disconnected because they're working with disconnected conceptions. Like the things that they are pursuing in a dissociated way. Um, so then we use sales as a series of images of like, how does this disconnection look? So the sailboat, um, so the sailboat is an old image. Saint Augustine talks about um, the sailboat, like, we're the sail, God provides the wind. Um, but so there's different variations. You could have someone who um, is making the mistake of believing that they are the sail and they provide their own wind. This is the New Age movement. This is claiming divinity um, by oneself, independent of anything, right? So I mean, the thing is like that, like the average Catholic should be mindful of the distinction there. Usually, they look at New Age um, believers and they think, oh, the mistake that they're making is that they think they can be God. That's not the mistake. That's our home turf. The mistake that they're making is that they think they can believe they can be God without God. So our tradition is that we are called to become by grace what God is by nature. But some people are saying, I'm the sail and I'm the wind. So I am God by nature. And that's a big mistake. Um, Another mistake would be believing that the wind is God, but that um, because the self is bad, they never actually raise up the sail. The sail in this image is the self, right? So if I think the self is bad and I view it with suspicion, um, and I think of it as a distraction from holiness, then I never raise it up and it can never catch the wind, right? So that's an image. Another is that you could have someone who believes that the God is the wind and the sail is self, but the sail has a bunch of holes in it. Um, and so when it's raised up, it can't actually catch the wind. And so this is someone whose heart has not yet been fully healed yet. And healing of the heart is possible. I mean, God has restored our heart. He has redeemed it. And that either immediately heals it or it enables the healing of the heart. So then, but again, if someone views the heart with suspicion, they're going to conceive of any kind of work that deals with healing of the heart as self-indulgent or selfish or some kind of form of weakness or something like that. So they never actually patch up those, they never repair the sail, and so it can never actually really catch the wind. As a side note for the listener, we go really in depth on that kind of work for repairing the sail. Stephen Lawson, who's a friend of mine, he's the founder of Monk Manual. We did a super deep dives, like 7-hour, 3-part series on his show, Potency, in which I demonstrate in real time what that kind of exercise looks like. How do you actually how do you recultivate the health of one's heart? And then lastly, there is the person who wants everything to be done by God. So this is the same as not raising up the sail. They want God to be both the wind and the sail. And they think that's humble. But what's really happening is God is holding a gift in his hand and he's reaching out to the person and saying, here's this thing that I've made for you. And they are saying, I don't want to be distracted by you. I want you're my everything. And he says, of course I'm your everything. So receive this. And he said, no, I don't want to become selfish or something. So there you have quietism. You have this self-annihilation and wrapped in good intention, wrapped in piety, and lacking in fruitfulness. It doesn't attract anyone to the church. It doesn't fill the church with joy or any of the fruits of the Spirit. They're all gone. So anyway, that's a riff on the image of the sailboat.
Yeah, and I think that's just such a wonderful, because I've always been a firm believer in the idea that the sum is greater than the parts. And going back to my days of playing music, if you have one person that thinks he's like leading, it can just become this like clash of egos. Whereas if you have like three
Yeah.
or four people that are listening to one another and participating in this like thing, the end result is something that I think is greater than what the individual persons are contributing. And the same thing goes with the idea of like the sailboat. The sailboat is what the sailboat does as it propels and moves a person. It's not just an individual isolated thing,
Right.
compartmentalized from everything else that's happening, that actually makes a sailboat do what a sailboat does, right? The telos of the sailboat, if you will. So yeah, I thought that was a great way of illustrating kind of what's happening here. And I mean, as far as it goes, Andy, I think we had like a really good conversation here. Do you have anything going on? This is going to go out this week, guys. It's the 5th today, 5th of February. And do you have anything going on, Andy, that you'd like the listeners who catch this in time to know about?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So there's a couple things. One is we regularly run live workshops. So this Friday, we're running a workshop on how to heal emotions. So this is a great like intro into like a practical method for, how do I look into the heart and restore it? Which is normally tossed over as like, okay, that's like this weird thing for the help crowd or whatever. But it's like totally this is our wheelhouse. We have the best conception of reality, and we have Grace animating the whole thing. It's like we should totally be doing this. So I'll be teaching a method for doing that, and I'll be demonstrating it live in real time with the participants. So that's happening this Friday from 10 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern time. If you are able to attend live, that's best. If you can't, if you register, you also have access to the recording of that. But yeah, that represents a typical thing that's going on. Is we are regularly doing live workshops. You can learn about those on our website, which is hel.co. The other thing, you mentioned the essay. That whole essay is available in its entirety on our website as well, so you can read that for free. That's definitely the deep dive. Some of you right now are listening. I mean, if you've gotten to this point, you've enjoyed the swirly, scenic vibe of this conversation, and it's awesome. And if you are looking to complement that with a linear articulation of how does this actually play out as a method for organizing my life, then the most helpful resource for you would be to begin with the landmark letters I've written. These are 13 letters that walk you sequentially through this process of how do you organize your life? What does that actually look like at a behavioral level? And you can read those for free if you go to our website, hel.co, so heal.co. There's a purple button that says Heal Your Creativity, and it'll open a form. And if you choose, like, there's something on that form that says, hey, yes, I want a free educational resource, that's going to send you these letters. And that would be, if that's what you're looking for, that's the most helpful place to start.
All right, Andy, I appreciate you coming on. I would really recommend you guys take the time. We'll include everything that we can down in the description. And take the time to go check out the website. And Andy's always got something going on over there, right? So be sure. Is there like I can't remember, Andy, it's like a newsletter that you send out too, if there's like a sign up for that to keep people kind of up to date on what's going on?
Yeah, we distribute that to someone if they finished the letter series,
Okay.
just to ensure we're sending it to people that are, they're interested.
All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you for taking the time today, Andy, to come talk with us. And hopefully we can get you back on again soon.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate it.
All right. God bless.